Okay, hello everybody. Today I have the pleasure to have a conversation with Mr. Jacques Pauwels. Jacques, thank you very much for having this conversation with me.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, Manuel. It's a pleasure to talk about important things.
Yes. Okay, let me introduce Jacques to you. Jacques is a retired university teacher uh, in Ontario, Canada. Jacques owned a PhD in history and a second PhD in political science. Jacques is the author of many books. And just to show the more important book that he made for me, uh, The Myth of the Good War. Now I show you the version of the book. I have them in French, but most of those books have been translated in English. So The Myth of the Good War, the United States and the Second World War. We have Big Business with Hitler. We have The Great Class War, 1914 to 1918. And I also have this one that I'm not sure. Has this book been translated in English?
Myths of Modern History.
Okay,
It's
the Myths of Modern History.
2022
Okay.
in Toronto.
Okay, because on your Wikipedia page, it didn't give the English translation, but
Well, Wikipedia is not reliable.
okay. So this is all the book that I own from you. Well, today me and Jacques, we decided to speak to you in English, but you have to know that both me and Jacques, English is not our first language. Jacques was born in Belgium, and his first language is, in French we say Flamand, but how do we say Flamand in English?
Flemish.
Flemish, okay, so Flemish is your first language. Okay, like me, my first language is French. So we have an accent. We apologize for that, but we're speaking in English in order to reach the most people. So another thing that me and Jacques, we don't share the same political perspective. Me, I'm mostly a libertarian, and Jacques is mostly a socialist and let's say a Marxist. It may seem like a opposition, but in fact, we almost agree a lot about the issue that we talk today, which is the myth of the Second World War. So this is not a debate, and this is more, as I said, my goal with those conversation is to bring the most arguments possible in order to debunk and demystify the Second World War. Because the myth of the Second World War is used again and again today to sell a lot of unjustified war. Like just right now, they're probably going to use the same idea that we have to stop Vladimir Putin in Russia and Ukraine, because otherwise we're going to have a Hitler, which is totally insane, and it could lead to a third world war with the total annihilation of mankind. So me, because I hate war, I bring to you a lot of arguments, even with people that are not libertarian like me. So, Jacques, today I want you to tell us why the Second World War was not a good war, like, you know, the Hollywood movies, the government schools, and the medias, and most politicians are telling us why it was not a good war. We listen to you.
Well, Manuel, I wrote a whole book about that.
Yes.
I cannot give the answer in a couple of sentences.
No.
But I do, in my book, the title alone talks about the myth of the good war. And indeed, the Second World War, the way what we are told about it is mostly the myth. Whereas in my book, I tried to get to the reality. And this is what the issue is. The myth is that the Second World War was a good war. It was good guys against bad guys. We are the good guys. The bad guys were Hitler and the Japanese and so on. And the idea is also that we fought purely defensively. We tried to avoid a war. we really didn't want war, but Hitler, bad guy as he was, he started it all, and we had no choice. And then the damn Japanese came in; they're also bad guys. And then the Americans, really good guys, who had earlier somehow, for some reason, not had an interest in intervening in the war against bad guy Hitler, are now actually fighting bad guys Japan, and somehow then also because of that have to fight against bad guy Hitler. But this, if you look at this, it doesn't seem to make sense. For example, the idea that the United States, for the United States, the leaders of the United States, the war was a war against dictatorship, against racism, against the bad guys and so on, doesn't seem to make sense for a number of reasons. If you ask yourself, for example, if the Americans were so keen to fight for democracy and against dictatorship and against racism and against anti-Semitism and against all these bad things that we, of course, blamed Hitler for, why did they not come in earlier? Why did it take until the end of 1941, when the war had already been going on for more than 2 years, for the United States finally to come in? And why did it take an attack by Japan on an American possession, namely Pearl Harbor in Hawaii? If they were so keen to fight for democracy, why did Washington not do much from the beginning? And why did they wait 2 years? And by the way, it was the same thing in the First World War, when also supposedly a good war where we, our side, fought for democracy and justice and so on, and where the United States also didn't come in from the beginning, but only joined the war in April 1917, when pretty well only 1 year before the end of the war. So there's a lot of reasons for questioning the official version of the war as a good war, right? There's some ways, of course, in which it is true that it was a good war. It is true that the enemy was evil. I mean, I am not defending Hitler here and saying, oh, he was not a bad guy at all. Hitler was a bad guy. And the Japanese regime was a bad regime. My question is that or the suggestion that I'm coming up with is that the official reason for going to war against them was not really that they were bad guys. It was that it was not true that they were against them because they weren't democratic. In fact, before the war, until 1939, in Britain and France, the leaders of those countries, and indeed the leaders of the United States, liked Hitler a lot, and they liked Mussolini a lot. In fact, they said good things about Hitler. It wasn't until really the 1939, only shortly before the war started, that Hitler became suddenly a bad guy. But before that, he was seen to be a pretty good fellow. And the reason for that is that the leaders of the United States and of Britain even, didn't have anything against fascism as such. And the reason for that is that they hated Bolshevism, they hated the Soviet Union, they hated communism. And Hitler was the ultimate anti-communist, the ultimate anti-Bolshevik. And everybody could read his book, Mein Kampf, where he said that he was going to destroy the Soviet Union. And that is something which many of the elites in London and Paris and in Washington and New York liked a lot. Because like them, they hated communism, they hated socialism, they hated their support that the Soviet Union gave to countries in the third world, for example, and the colonies of the Western world. They support liberation movements. So the Western elites in Paris, London, and New York, and elsewhere had many reasons actually for hating the Soviet Union, and therefore for liking the enemy of the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, and fascist movements in general, right? And that is really why they were not keen to fight a war against Hitler. In fact, even until 1941, the United States wanted no war with Hitler. In fact, it was only because the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor that the United States got involved in the war against that the United States got involved in the war against Germany, and they didn't have to. In fact, it was meant to be. The idea was that Japan had attacked the United States, and therefore the United States, the following day, the day after Pearl Harbor, declared war on Japan, but not on Germany, because Nazi Germany had nothing to do with the attack on the Pearl Harbor. And therefore, basically, the United States had no reason to declare war on Germany. But the thing is, the surprising thing is that 4 days after Pearl Harbor, Hitler declared war in the United States.
Exactly.
Without having to do that. That was actually a surprise, a total surprise, which it arrived in Washington as a big shock. It was something they had not counted on. So you actually say that the United States never declared war on Nazi Germany. It was the other way around. You know? In fact, if Hitler had not declared war on Nazi Germany, on the United States, we can ask ourselves, when would the United States then actually have intervened in the war against Hitler? The chances are they maybe never, you know. So that these are reasons why.
Question.
Yes.
Okay. I agree with what you say, and I know what you're gonna go with that, and it's very important. But the United States. I think they were kind of provocative in a little bit against Nazi Germany. For example, wasn't the U.S. Navy giving the position of the U-boats to the British?
Well, you're talking about the so-called undeclared naval war of the United States against Germany in the fall of 1941, actually.
Yes.
Sorry, there was indeed, I'm not saying that the relations between the United States and Germany were good or wonderful, certainly not wonderful, before they ended up fighting each other as a result of or following the Japanese attack. The relations were poor because the United States had actually an interest in supporting Britain when it was still fighting Nazi Germany. After the defeat of France, Britain was the only country basically hanging in there. France had been knocked out of the war, and Britain was still fighting. And Britain was at that stage the only enemy really remaining of Hitler. But the United States did wonderful business supporting Britain. And in the United States, while some companies, some corporations, and many banks actually made a lot of money dealing with Nazi Germany and making money thanks to Hitler, because of their investments in Nazi Germany, which I talk about a lot in my books, you know. Other segment of the American business world, you know, made a lot of money doing business with Britain via the so-called Lend-Lease plan. A lot of American banks were loaning money to Britain to buy equipment in the United States. So actually, for the American economy, the war was a good thing. Because before that, in the 30s, you know, during the Great Depression, the economy was in bad shape. You might say that the war in Europe actually caused the American economy to revive and to get going again. And one of the big things, the big advantages was that they could sell and produce and loan money. The banks loan money, and the big industrialists produce for Britain during, as it was still fighting against the Soviet Union, against the Nazi Germany. So that, of course, is something that material support that the United States gave to Britain in its war with Germany was something that the Germans didn't particularly like. And that caused some friction. But it was not a reason for going to war. Even today, for example,
so you were going to say why did Hitler declared war to the United States? Is it what you were going to talk about?
No, I was going to get to that later on. It's something that needs to be explained big time, for sure. Yeah. Well, let me jump forward then, because in a way we should sort of make this presentation systematic and in a right chronological order. But we're going to be obviously jumping around a bit from the early stages of the war to the later stages and so on, and that's okay. But it is indeed a problem. The issue is, why did Hitler declare war on the United States on December 11, 1941, 4 days after Pearl Harbor? Okay, let's reconstruct. Japan and Germany were allies, okay?
Yes.
Allies. And the theory is that when Japan attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor, that Hitler then had no choice but to also declare war on the United States, because he was committed to his ally. And that's simply not true. You will read that in quite a few history books. They'll say, well, yeah, Hitler, he had to, because he was an ally of Japan, and therefore Japan, now at war with the United States, he had no choice but to also enter the war with the United States. And that's not true, for the simple reason that the alliance between Nazi Germany and Japan was a defensive alliance, whereby they promised each other to come to each other's aid in case that the other party, the partner, was attacked by a third party, okay? But not when that your country attacks another country. In other words, when, for example, Nazi Germany declared war, attacked Poland in 1939, Japan did not declare war on Poland. When Nazi Germany attacked Holland, Belgium, and France in 1940, Japan did not declare war on Holland, France, and Belgium. You know, because there's no need to it, right? In fact, when Hitler attacked the Soviet Union in the spring of or in the late spring of 1941, Japan was thinking about declaring war but didn't. Okay, so there was no obligation on the part of the United States in December 1941 to actually declare war on the United States. So why did he do it? Well, he did it out of desperation. He did it out of desperation because in the summer of 1941, he had launched his major attack on the Soviet Union, which something he had dreamed of all his life, and something which for many reasons he actually had to do because Nazi Germany at that stage was running out of petroleum, and only through the conquest of the Soviet Union, which Hitler thought was going to be easy, would basically a pushover, would Germany be able to lay its hands on the oil wells, the petroleum wells of the Caucasus in the Soviet Union, and also the riches of Ukraine and all kinds of wonderful resources which the Soviet Union had plenty of and which Germany needed really badly. So Hitler attacked the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941, convinced that he's going to win a major victory within a few months. It's going to be all over by September 1st, and then he's going to have the petroleum of the Caucasus and the rich agricultural land of Ukraine, make a note of it, right? And then that's going to solve all his problems. And if indeed Nazi Germany would have defeated the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, Germany would today still be the major power in Europe, because neither the British or the Americans would ever have been able to defeat Nazi Germany. The proof is simple. When in 1944, the Allies landed in France, in June 1944, they had a hard time, and they were only fighting less than 10% of the German army, because 90% of the German army was still fighting on the Eastern Front, hanging on for dear life. But if Germany would have defeated the Soviet Union 2 years earlier, the entire German army would have been in Normandy, all of it. And the British and Americans wouldn't have had a chance, not a hope in hell of a successful landing in Normandy. And that way, then Germany, I shouldn't say would have won the war, but Germany would have remained basically in control of Europe. And the Americans would have not have been able to do anything about it. So that is why Hitler then went to war against the Soviet Union, and he was convinced he was going to win a major victory in no time at all. And that would all solve his problems and would guarantee that Germany would be a major superpower, that could actually easily confront the United States or any other major power. But it didn't work out. And in September 1941, in October, November, they're still fighting, and the outlook for a victory now is diminishing quickly, right? And by December the 5th, 1941.
December the 5th.
That's correct. The 5th, 2 days before Pearl Harbor.
Exactly.
So a Red Army counterattack in front of Moscow, right? And that's when the Germans get a bloody nose. And on that day, Hitler's generals told him that he could no longer expect to win the war. On that day. But nobody knew that, right? And this is now get this. This is before the United States entered the war, okay? So Germany basically is already doomed to lose the war even before the United States enters the war. So Hitler, of course, is not very happy with the news. And a couple of days later, he reads it in the paper because the Japanese had never told him about their plans for Pearl Harbor. He reads that his Japanese friends have attacked the United States. And he comes as a surprise to him. And he's thinking about that. And suddenly he thinks he has a bright idea. He now decides to declare war on the United States to basically, as a show of solidarity with his Japanese allies, even though he doesn't have to do it. So why does he do it? His generals say it's crazy because we're going to have another enemy and we're already in deep trouble in Russia. But Hitler's line of thinking is that if he does that, if he do a show of solidarity with Tokyo, Tokyo will reciprocate. And Tokyo will then declare war on his enemy, the Soviet Union. And don't forget that the bulk of the Japanese army at that stage is actually based in northern China on the borders with the Soviet Union near Vladivostok. And indeed, if the Japanese army from there would have attacked the Soviet Union would have had to fight a war on two fronts, against the Germans in the west and against the Japanese in the east. Mm-hmm. And that must have been Hitler's way of thinking, would still have given Germany a chance to win the war. Not certain, but at least a chance. Yes. Whereas his generals had told him, basically we're going to lose the war. And so it was actually out of desperation that Hitler gambled that this would pay off. But what happened is that Japan said, thank you very much, Mr. Hitler, but did not declare war on the Soviet Union. So Hitler was screwed, because now he was not only still in deep trouble in the Soviet Union, but he also had basically had no hope that the Japanese would help. And he's going to have a new enemy that's going to show up on his shores sooner or later, right? And the fact then that Japan did not respond with a declaration of war against the Soviet Union allowed the Soviets to pull troops from Vladivostok, from the far east of Siberia, to the Western Front, to fight against the Germans and make the situation militarily for Germany even worse, right? So that is the reason why Hitler declared war in the United States. But for the United States, it was a big surprise, because they had never thought that Hitler would do that. The United States had plans for a war against Japan, but this is important. The United States in 1941 had no plans for war against Nazi Germany whatsoever, all right? Because this is another argument against the idea that the United States wanted to fight against evil like Nazism and Hitler and all that stuff. In the 1930s and until 1941, the United States had plans for war against 4 countries. And don't get me wrong, when I say they had plans for war, doesn't mean that they were planning to have a war, but they were thinking about the possibility, okay? They had no plans for war, for example, against Namibia or some country far away. No, they had plans for war against countries that they thought there might be a war. It doesn't mean that they want it right now, but, thinking about it. The United States had plans for war against Mexico, against which they had fought wars before that brought them California, Arizona, New Mexico, lots of territory, right?
Texas.
Easy. They had plans for war against Japan, which were ready in 1941, Japan for war, including, by the way, long-distance war across the Pacific, which is why they had developed the aircraft carriers and long-distance bombers like the B-17, all developed in the 30s. Don't believe for a minute what some historians like to tell you, that the United States was not prepared for war at all, and it had to start from scratch after the surprise attack by Japan. Come on, the long-distance bombers and the aircraft carriers have been developed since the late 1920s, for warfare against Japan. They were never made for warfare on Lake Ontario or on the St. Lawrence River or on the Bay of St. Lawrence, right? They were made for warfare across the Pacific, right? So that's what happened. The United States had plans for war against Japan, but there was no plans for war against Germany. By the way, so the United States had plans for war against Mexico, against Japan, and the third plans for war against Canada and Great Britain, because Canada and Great Britain had always been the enemy of the United States. Certainly the British were not such great friends until the First World War, for sure not. After the First World War, a little bit, but also rivals, in the race or the struggle for supremacy in the Western camp, right? So that there were plans for warfare. In fact, the plans for war, and this is serious, by the way, I can refer you to a serious study about that. And these plans were leaked in the 50s and caused some discomfort, in the government and in the media in the United States and in Canada. And it involved actually bombing 3 cities, Vancouver, Toronto, and Halifax. They should bomb Montreal too, right? It's not fair that Quebec exactly. They should complain in Quebec. They would bomb Vancouver, Toronto, and Halifax with poison gas bombs, and that is a fact. But there was no plans for war against Nazi Germany whatsoever, right? Not zilch, which shows that there was really no interest in the United States for fighting against the evil Mr. Hitler. They didn't really care. And by the way, many American businessmen did wonderful business with Nazi Germany. They did business with Nazi Germany, for example, via their branch plans, which they had started up in Germany in the 1920s and 30s, and which made a lot of money by making weapons for Hitler. For example, Singer sewing machines had a plant in Germany, and they made money in Hitler, lots of money in Nazi Germany, not by making sewing machines, but by switching to the production of machine guns, because sewing machines and machine guns, it's a similar technology, right? So Singer made a lot of money selling machine guns, and Ford and General Motors and IBM and ITT and all these big American corporations had branch plants in Germany that made a lot of money thanks to Hitler's war.
And you discuss in details,
yes,
these things in great details in those 2 books.
That's correct. I give lots of details, especially in my book on big business with Hitler. So that's why. So they made a lot of money. So essentially, this is an important point, Manuel. You'll appreciate that. The war was good for business. Hitler was good for business. His war was good for business. The British war against Hitler was also good for business, right? And then the war with Japan would also be good for business. So essentially, the war was wonderful for American business. And now you have to understand that before that, in the 30s, business was very, very bad. And now in the 40s, business is very, very good. In the 30s, business was bad because it was peace, well, mostly. And the 40s, business is good because there's war. And this is a lesson that we should keep in mind today. War is good for business. It's not good for the little guys who have to do the fighting and the killing. That's not good for them. But for the big shots with the big money, it's very, very good. War is a way in which actually, all people contribute their labor, their efforts, their military service, their taxes to finance a war, but the profits of war, because war generates profits. Who produces all these weapons? Well, the big armament industry, the military industrial complex, as Eisenhower called it, they make the money. So wars are a way in which the costs are socialized, and the profits are privatized.
Exactly.
So what you have is a redistribution of money. War allows the redistribution of money from the pockets of the little guys into the wallets and the bank accounts of the rich guys. And that's what's the case even today. The war against Afghanistan, the war in Afghanistan, was a humiliating affair. It was the longest war in Canadian and American history, and it cost zillions of dollars. And it ended up with a very humiliating withdrawal. But you know what? Lots of money was made in that war, right? So as long as a lot of people made money, but the average Canadian, the average American paid for it, but the wealthy Americans who basically are the folks of the military industrial complex, they made a lot of money. And that's why the war in Ukraine is good, because they can supply, they can give or sell to the Ukrainians all kinds of weapons, which the Russians destroy pretty well immediately, and send more. And the bills get paid, and the money is made, the profits are privatized, and the costs are shared by all Americans and all people in countries that belong to NATO.
Yes, on that I absolutely agree with you.
So, but you had a question about.
Oh, sure.
You had a question about the war of Germany against the Soviet Union, and whether maybe that was an attack that was to prevent a Soviet attack on Nazi Germany.
There is a thesis of people who are very supportive of Nazi Germany. They say that Nazi Germany didn't have the choice to attack the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union was planning to attack Western Europe. And they say that the reason why the Soviet Union got a lot of loss in the first month of the war was because their armies was in an offensive position. What do you think about this thesis?
Well, this thesis is already very, very old, Manuel. It was first concocted, I believe, in the 1960s in Germany by a German historian whose name I forgot. And it's a thesis that was dismissed pretty well immediately by serious historians from the left and the right, from everybody, because there was really no serious evidence at all. But it's a theory that pleased a lot of people. The reason why people, the media, and even scholars accept a thesis or reject it is not always based on scientific considerations. It's often based on what you like. The thesis that's pleasant, something that we like to hear, we agree with, and something that we don't particularly like to hear, we disagree with. What I mean? It's basic psychology. So that thesis, while it appealed to some people who really wanted to believe that, in fact, it's understandable. It was rejected by most historians. But one of the problems with that thesis is that was exactly Hitler's explanation. Hitler's explanation was that he attacked because the Soviets were going to attack us. And mind you, Hitler also said he attacked Poland because Poland was going to attack them, right? So that's the classical defense or rationalization of an aggressor by saying we're attacking because the other guys were going to attack us, and we just basically, our attack is defensive, But it's one of the major reason why that theory that Stalin, that the Soviet Union was ready to attack poor Nazi Germany, you know, and Nazi Germany basically responded by attacking her, by surprising the Soviets, so to speak. One of the major reasons for that is very simple. You know, in 1941, when the attack came, when presumably Nazi Germany would have, the Soviet Union presumably then would have been ready to attack Nazi Germany. The reason why nobody in Moscow, you know, would have dreamed of that is that it would have been obviously suicidal. And the reason why it would have been suicidal is that, first of all, the Nazi Germany had shown that its army was the mightiest military machine on earth at the time, you know, and that's not exaggerating, because look how they had defeated Poland and Belgium and France and Greece and Yugoslavia, you know, no time at all, you know, they were like invincible. In fact, when they were ready to attack the Soviet Union, when they did attack the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941, the consensus in London and Washington was that it was all going to be over in 6 to 8 weeks, that the Red Army didn't have a chance against it. You know, that this mighty machine, the Wehrmacht, would just roll to Moscow, no problem at all. In fact, one American military chief said that the German army is going to go to the Red Army like a hot knife to the butter. You know, and in Britain, somebody said that the Germans are going to crack the Soviet Union, you know, like an egg, you know, just like that, no problem at all. So the idea that the Soviets would have been felt strong enough, you know, to attack Nazi Germany, you know, is just unthinkable. But there's another reason for that. Not only would they not been stupid enough to attack what was the mightiest military force on earth, but that Nazi Germany, they knew very well, had an alliance with Japan, right? Talked about an alliance. And remember now, that alliance kicked in when one of the two partners was attacked by a third party.
Oh, right? Yes.
Are you with me? So that means that if Stalin would have been crazy enough to attack the Nazi Germany in the spring of 1941, the summer, Japan would have automatically intervened and would have attacked the Soviet Union in the forest. I mean, hello, how stupid, how crazy do you expect people in Moscow to have been at the time? It's just simply unthinkable. There's no way to have done that. You know, there's no way.
Thank you very much for this, because you brought me some element that I didn't have, because
yeah, I know.
I see people, as a revisionist, I see people that are sometimes a lot more on the side of Nazi Germany, and they bring that. And I had, for me, okay, maybe it was possible, but I'm glad you gave a reason that is very convincing why the Soviet Union was probably not in that mood, if we can say that.
Yeah. Yeah, and by the way, the reason why the Soviet Union took a real beating at first in the early stages of the war, you know, is pretty simple actually. You know, it had nothing to do with the fact that they were prepared to attack and then they were suddenly attacked themselves and weren't ready for that. I mean, the Red Army knew very well that sooner or later Nazi Germany would attack them. There was no illusions whatsoever. In fact, they had been spending for years already, they had been preparing defenses. But the Soviets had also learned a lesson when they saw what happened to Poland in 1939 and to Belgium, Holland, and France in 1940, you know, how the Germans attacked. And the attack was always a blitzkrieg attack, meaning that planes and tanks would pierce through your lines and race deep ahead and then encircle the enemy forces. I won't get into too many details. But essentially, the Nazi system of warfare was the lightning warfare, was blitzkrieg warfare, right? And that meant that you basically you realize that the Germans, with their military might and with their aircraft and people in troops even falling from the sky dropping from the sky with parachutes and gliders, and in these tanks that would break through and race for hundreds of miles behind your lines and then swing back and encircle you, that the only defense that could work against that was defense in depth, okay? That the idea of stopping them right there at the first line, like in the First World War, when the first trench is where you try to stop the enemy, and if not the second trench, and if not the third trench, you know, that won't work. That was the idea of the Maginot Line that the French built after the First World War. Maginot Line was useless, right? It never played a role. Right? Exactly. So what happened was that when the French and the Belgians and the French in 1930-40, when the Germans attacked, were there in the trenches thinking First World War again. Where are the Germans, right? They were ready for them. But suddenly the Germans were above their head, in front of them, above them, and behind them already. And next thing, it's game over, right? So the only defense is defending in depth, okay? And now Russia has a lot of depth, to defend. Yes. But it also meant that you still had your defenses at the border, but you knew damn well that these defenses were going to be overrun. So what you had to do is keep troops behind, not only a few miles behind, no, 100 kilometers behind, 200 kilometers behind, and Russia has the space. Holland and Belgium didn't have that space. France a little more, but not enough, right? So what I'm saying is that when the Germans attacked the Soviet Union in June of 1922, it was obvious that the Soviet troops at the first lines, were going to have to be sacrificed pretty well, and that the Germans were going to penetrate deep into the country. But that's the whole thing. Marshal Zhukov later on explained that the only reason why they survived the first attack at all was by defense in depth. They always held troops back. The Germans were very successful at first, right? But the white flag never went up, right? Oh. They kept on plugging ahead. Hundreds of kilometers, but they were waiting for that white flag to come up, and it never did. And after a few weeks already, by early July 1941, unbeknownst to the rest of the world, within Germany, within the general headquarters, among Nazi bigwigs like Goebbels, there was already concern that, yes, we're doing well, but you know what? Not well enough. We take lots of prisoners, we have lots of victories, but you know what? We don't have that decisive victory where we bottle up the bulk of the army and they have to surrender or we destroy them. It never happened, did it? It never happened. Success after success, but no matter how deep they penetrated into Russian territory, they never could somehow manage to get the Red Army to capitulate. There was always more of them to come up, right? And after a few weeks already, Goebbels was writing his diary that the war is not going as per plan. And not only that, the Soviets counterattacked on a number of occasions because they were prepared for that, right? Which, by the way, the preparations for counterattacks were also part of the system of defense of the Soviet Union. And then these preparations for counterattacks were later on interpreted by these people that argue that the Soviets were preparing an offensive war by saying, see, they prepared some attacking strategies as well, which of course they did, because they weren't going to be defending, they were also counterattacking. So that is what happened then. That is what happened. The Soviets, the Red Army, was successful because they had learned the lessons of the German victories and then the Polish and French and Belgian defeats in 1939, 1940 to defend in depth. That meant big losses at an early stage near the border, but then increasing resistance as you pulled back, and you still had plenty of men left. And then when it turned out that Japan was not going to come to war to help to the aid of the Germans, then they could bring troops over from Vladivostok and eastern Siberia, and then they would help, and that was the beginning of the end. That is when on December 1941, the Red Army could launch a counterattack, and that's the day, December 5, write it down, the turning point of the war, when the generals told Hitler, you're going to lose the war.
Yeah. And you say it clearly, I think, in your books. I think you say that clearly in your books, and I remembered it.
Yes, well, there you go. It's a good thing. Okay. It's one thing to read a book. It's another thing to understand what's being said.
I read it twice, by the way. I read it like at least 10 years ago, and before we had this conversation, I wanted to read it a second time. And okay, other question. For you, what is the root cause of imperialism and those big world war? What is the main root cause? For me, as a libertarian, it's the fact that the state intervened in the economy. Right. It's the fact, it's the and that you may disagree on that, but I think maybe we can agree that the merging of the state with the corporations leads to imperialism. Do you agree with that?
Well, let me just say I agree, yes and no. I agree a little bit.
Go ahead.
Yeah. No, I deal with that topic in my book on the First World War. It's called The Great Glass War, in which there's a big chapter on the 19th century. Yes. Um, some people that play or criticize this book for having a long introduction about the 19th century. In fact, I start with the French Revolution. But the reason for that is that you cannot begin to understand the First World War until you understand what happened before, what led to the First World War. And similarly, you can understand the Second World War unless you know the First World War. The First and Second World War were imperialist wars. Wars of imperialism.
Totally agree with that.
But not only that, but they were and when we say imperialist wars, they were wars that were meant to conquer on behalf of the national economies, as it was then called. Today we have transnational economies, we have multinationals, but in those days most economies were national, like German companies doing business in Germany, French companies doing business in France, and those national companies basically being managed by the national governments. Okay, and that's what you're referring to. What you have is basically a collaboration between industry and governments. All right. And this emerged, this idea that the state must manage the economy a bit, is something that emerges in the late 1800s. And it's a very, very, how should I, a very important moment in the history of capitalism, which you're interested in, I know, because originally capitalism believes in entrepreneurs doing their own thing, competing freely on an open market, blah, 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 blah. And the government's basically just standing by, the night watch government, right? Laissez-faire. The government shouldn't get involved unless it's absolutely necessary, right? But the problem with that is that what happens is, while this is indeed the philosophy of capitalists in most of the 19th century, by the 1870s, you have the development of bigger and bigger corporations. I mean, essentially, the competition among all these still producers leads to some being more successful than others and gobbling up others. Sure, it's like mergers, as we would call them now, right? It's like you see that now too. The big ones buy up the smaller ones, and even other big ones, and they cannibalize each other. So what you have is more and more bigger companies, and these become basically the, how should I say, the golden boys in any of these national economies. You have, for example, the big automobile manufacturers come up, steel manufacturers like Thyssen in Germany, and the arms manufacturers like Krupp and all that stuff, and these are the backbones of the national industries. And these companies become big producers. And as big producers, they now start to have big problems. Well, that's the big problems. The big problems are that to produce big, you need the raw materials that need to go in the production process. For example, in the late 1800s, what will become really an important raw material which you need with the advent of the automobile is petroleum and rubber, okay? Which in the old days played no role, but now you have Ford and Mercedes in Germany, the big car manufacturers, and they need rubber. But you know what? There is no rubber in Germany, and there is no petroleum in Germany. And some other countries with big industries have the same problem, that they have to have these resources, these raw materials, and there's some to be found somewhere else. Well, if they have to be found somewhere else, we have to get it from somewhere else, okay? We don't have petroleum. The British, for example, have no petroleum. Their whole navy ran on coal for the 19th century. But by 1900, petroleum becomes the fuel of choice, the essential. They can't live without fuel for big ships. The Royal Navy needs petroleum. Well, there is no petroleum in Scotland, Ireland, anywhere in the British Isles. No. But they find out there's petroleum in the Middle East. Are you with me? They find out there's petroleum in the Middle East. So they must have the Middle East. Who owns the Middle East? The Ottoman Empire. A big empire, but not a militarily weak. Well, we're going to grab it from them. We're going to grab Mesopotamia, Iraq. We're going to grab Persia, Iran. That's where the oil is. We want it. And if we don't want it, the others will get it, right? The Germans are building the Baghdad Railway from Berlin to Baghdad. Oh my God, if they complete that, they're going to get the oil. We want the oil. So the British and the Germans now competing already. So what you have is that these big companies that need raw materials like oil and rubber, how they need their governments to do what they feel needs to be done is basically take over these faraway countries, establish colonies, protectorates, so you can not only get the stuff yourself there and then compete advantageously against the other guys, right? But you can also then sell exclusively your own products over there. So colonies become very important. That's why you have That's why you have in the 1880s a big scramble for Africa. Everybody wants a colony in Africa now because Africa has all kinds of goodies. Little Belgium got the Congo, and what did the Congo do for Belgium? It was full of copper. You know, copper was an important, very important material, right? There was no copper in Belgium, but Belgium was already highly industrialized. But Belgium has no raw materials. So Belgium needed colonies, if you know what I mean. Same with Holland, same with France. They needed Africa, but Africa was basically the El Dorado of these companies. And each time, it's the government that has to take the lead. So these big companies and the banks that finance them are relying on their governments, to do what needs to be done. Send in the discoverers, the Stanleys, the Livingstones, pay for them, and then pay to take over the country. Send in the soldiers to basically to control the country and to force people to work in the mines so you can get a copper. And by the way, Belgium would benefit from that also, because in the Congo, they got the uranium in the Second World War, and they sold that to the United States to bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki, okay? Which the Americans did not bomb with uranium from Ontario, as people think, but from the Belgian Congo at the time. So you can see how this becomes very, very important, right? So that is what leads to imperialism, essentially. Every national economy feels that we have to have the raw materials and we have to have these markets, right? Because if we don't have them, our competitors will get them, right? And that's how you get a scramble for Africa, and that leads to conflict, to rivalry, conflict, and that'll lead to the First World War, right? And that is how we ended up with this imperialism then causing imperial rivalries, imperial conflicts, imperial wars, imperialist wars, like the First World War. And the First World War was an imperialist war, but it wasn't decisive because it was won by Britain and France, right? But Britain and France were exhausted at the end of the war, right? It was lost by Germany, but Germany escaped most of the consequences of the losses. I can get into that. And then the First World War also offered an opportunity for two countries that were previously not big competitors in the struggle among imperialists, but now will be the United States and Japan, right? So now we have the big players now are Germany, Britain, France, United States, Japan, and they all want to be number one. And that's the issue. And that issue then is not settled in 1918. And that's why it starts again in 1939, 1940. In fact, many historians say that the First World War and the Second World War are connected.
Oh, yeah.
Essentially, two parts of one war. They call it the 30 Years War of the 20th century.
Yeah, there are some people that call it like that, yeah. I absolutely, what you just say, I absolutely agree. Yeah. The way you say it. Now, for me, the solution would be that the state must absolutely stop to intervene in the economy. So, but there are other people that think that it's the private property of the means of production is the problem. So.
Well, exactly. It was a natural evolution. The idea of little producers competing happily in an open market, it just didn't work. And the reality was that it was a consolidation, gigantism, because bigger and bigger units fighting each other. Yeah.
Is there a book written by someone in 1916 that explains that?
Yes, and the guy's name is Lenin.
I'm just gonna take the book. I'm sure you have it too.
Yes, I have that too. Yes, it's Capitalism. Well, it's a very good book. He wrote that in the First World War, and he's right on in many ways. He explains. But you know what? Lenin actually got the idea from a British, what's his name, Hobson, the British scholar who actually wrote about that, where he pointed out the same problems before him. So you might say that that Lenin was not the only one.
Okay.
We, of course, like to, in the Western world, try not to pay attention to what Lenin had to say. But I mean, it's an idea that was already around, that people realize already that imperialism was a problem, and that was leading to war inescapably, and it did lead to a world war because it led to a world war because these colonies were spread all over the world, and therefore the conflict between imperialist powers would affect all the entire world. For example, most people don't realize that the First World War was not only fought in Flanders fields, It was also fought I was recently in Africa, in Tanzania. It was fought in China. It was fought in the Middle East. It was fought in many, many countries all over the world. That's why it's called the World War, which started off as the Great War, a European war, but it soon became a real world war because it was an imperialist war.
Another question, and look, on that, we have no disagreement, maybe except for the ideal solution.
Yes,
so,
that's a different story.
Many libertarian people laugh at me because they say, I remember being laughed at because they said that I use too much the word imperialism, and for them it's a Marxist word. No, it's when someone is right. If Lenin is right about it, he's right about it. So,
Manuel, I just want to say that imperialism is real. We just don't want to talk about it. We just don't want to talk about it because it's a topic that's not pleasant. The people don't want to hear that. For example, the idea that the United States is an imperialist power is something that, oh my God, it's democracy, isn't it? And Britain, oh yeah, people will say imperialism was true. Britain was an empire way back when, but now it's democracy. Well, I'm sorry, we're still very much imperialist powers, you know. In fact, what we call the Western world is the imperialist world.
Yeah, and in fact, it goes to my next question. Is there a big difference between a liberal democracy and fascism when we talk about imperialism?
Well, there is a big difference. There is a big difference. I would rather live in a liberal democracy than in a fascist system.
And I agree with that. Yeah. Yes,
but
me too.
But the reality is that the capitalist system, the imperialist capitalist system, because imperialism is capitalism active worldwide. You know, it's basically the international manifestation of capitalism, right? Capitalism can function in a democratic system or relatively democratic because ideal democracies don't exist. You know, in fact, most democracies I call pseudo-democracies. They're a bit like democracies, but they're pseudo-democracies, right? But okay, even a pseudo-democracy is better than a full-fledged dictatorship. But the reality is that when a capitalist system, a capitalist society feels threatened, they feel they can no longer allow democracy because it's too risky. And then they switch to a fascist system.
Yeah.
And that's what happened in the 1920s in much of Europe, because of course the war had produced a big revolution, and that was the Soviet Union that brought about the Soviet Union. And there was a great fear in other capitalist countries, other ones than Russia, which was not fully capitalist, but that's a different story. There was a great fear that there might be a revolution that would bring about the overthrow of capitalism. And that's when a lot of these systems, they felt that democracy was just simply a luxury we could no longer afford. Liberal democracy, because the danger was that between the socialists and the communists, they may get a majority and then bring about a revolution. And that's why they decided better a good dictatorship. And that's why in Italy, they brought in Mussolini. In Germany, brought in Hitler. In Spain, they brought in Franco. Each country in a different way. Each country is different, you know. In other countries, they did not feel the need, okay? And I write about that in my book on the First World War, why that is. In countries like Belgium and Holland, there was also a fascism on offer. And fascism was also quite successful, but it never came to power because the system never really required a fascist intervention. You know, France is an interesting case because in France, the majority of the elites wanted a fascist system, but they couldn't bring it in. But actually, they ended up importing one via an engineered and orchestrated defeat of the country in 1940. Because
explain a little bit about that.
But that's what happened in 1934 already, 35. After what had happened in Germany, where Hitler had come to power in 1933. And also Hitler followed the example of Mussolini, who had been installed in power, brought into power in 1922. The elites in France, you know, and I don't only mean the bankers and industrialists, but also the large landowners, the church, the conservative elites. You know, they would have loved to have a fascist system. And actually, many of the monarchs loved fascist systems. You know that, right? They would have loved it, and they were trying to bring one in. But in 1934, there was a reaction against that. And in fact, the result was that the opposite was in 1936 in France. A popular front government came to power of socialists and communists. And that was, my God, that was like the end of the world for these people. So they decided that something had to be done to prevent socialism, communism, coming to power and the revolution. God knows what could have happened. And the solution, actually, in a nutshell, right? And it's scary to think about it, is that the elite decided that they would import fascism the hard way, namely via a military defeat against Nazi Germany. Because while Germany was the external enemy, these elites hated even more their internal enemy, the socialists and the communists. And by orchestrating a defeat of their powerful army, an unnecessary defeat, the strange defeat that has been called, they allowed the Germans to come in. And what happened is they could bring into power Mr. Pétain, who was the equivalent of Franco, the equivalent of Mussolini, the equivalent of Hitler in France.
And so on that point, I also tend to agree that it's the reality that the French bourgeoisie preferred being Hitler than lose its private property that, in my opinion, is not really legitimate, but that's another topic. But France, if we talk about fascism, I think there are some Marxist historians that says that there was an episode it was the word fascism was probably not invented at that time, but I think in 1848 or 1852, when the French bourgeoisie preferred the dictatorship of Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. Yes. I heard some people call it some proto-fascism.
Well, but it's actually not quite right. What you have is what's called Bonapartism. Yeah. Bonapartism, yes, but it's not quite the same thing. But I know what you're saying. There's a similarity. It's basically the idea that democracy is too risky, and a strong man who sees it our way is a better solution. So that is, in a way, that's the fascist system. Yeah. But you can't compare Napoleon III in that respect with, say, a Hitler or Mussolini. I mean, Napoleon III was a pretty mild figure, so to speak, a moderate figure compared to the fascists. Okay. But just the idea is the same. Somebody who's going to control the masses, basically on behalf of the bourgeoisie and the elite in general. Yes.
But that's the principle that the ruling class will prefer a dictatorship than democracy when it's.
That's correct.
Yes. When it is threatened. Okay. Do you have time for a few more questions? Because I think. Yes.
But can I say something about democracy?
Of course.
In my book about the First World War. Yeah. In my book about the First World War, I start with a long introduction about the 19th century, and I start with the French Revolution. And in fact, what it is the history of democracy. Because the French Revolution was the first time when there was an advance made towards democracy in a European country. Well, you can argue about Switzerland and the Netherlands, but I mean, these were minor countries and not quite the same thing. So in many ways, the history of the democracy in the 19th century is what we are dealing with here. We're dealing with economic history, the system called capitalism and its ideology, liberalism, now neoliberalism and all that stuff, and how it fits with the interests of the elites and the interests of the masses, and how what the ordinary people want and how they would benefit and all that stuff. These are the big issues that we're dealing with here, and they have to be resolved in one way. And I touched on this class conflict when I mentioned, for example, how wars are terrible for ordinary people, because the ordinary people pay the price of war. They are saddled with the costs of war, whereas the elites are appropriating the profits of war. The profits are privatized, right? So that is what I'm dealing with. And the issue of democracy, the progress made by democracy, and basically the reverses of suffered by democracy in the context of wars and revolutions, since the French Revolution. The French Revolution was a revolution that made advance the cause of democracy, but it was stopped by wars, right? And that happened later on. And conversely, wars, since they make life miserable for ordinary people, tend to make them into revolutionaries, which they are not by nature, and therefore tends to cause revolutions. So wars lead to revolutions, and revolutions then are often lead to wars, because the war is a way of stopping the revolution. So just to make it in a nutshell here.
On that, I absolutely recognize that
and I want to say
there's a conflict between social class. I may have a different definition and interpretation than you do. What are those class? But I absolutely recognize that they exist and that they are in conflict, and that I think Lenin said the state is a tool for the ruling class. So, okay. My next question, which is it's a very important for me and the way I see the things. Why do you think that Britain and France, who were the two biggest colonial empire, so they had invaded and occupied, I think, a quarter of the land mass of the planet, why did they declare war on Germany in 1939? Was it because they really care about the sovereignty of the Polish people?
No, it was not. No. Let me just say something. Britain and France declared war on Germany after Germany invaded Poland, right? Yeah. On the 1st of September. Yeah. And it took a few days for Britain to respond. Yeah. And then they declared war, but didn't wage war. The French called it la drôle de guerre, you know, the phony war, right? The Sitzkrieg in German, right? In other words, what they declared was they declared phony war, meaning it was a phony declaration of war, meaning they didn't really want war. In fact, they've declared war to impress the public, who were very unhappy with the way the governments had been managing the crisis with Hitler, right? And they had basically, until that time, the governments in Paris and London had basically always given in to Hitler, not because they were afraid of war, as they said, but they wanted Hitler to fight war against the Soviet Union, which would get them off the hook. That's why they gave him Czechoslovakia, for example. They let him take over Austria because he needed a way, you know, to move east. So the idea of the elites that were in charge of the governments in France and in England, Britain, in the 1930s, was to somehow manipulate Hitler, manipulate him, encourage him, and make it possible for him to march to the east to destroy the Soviet Union. The problem was that they could not say that to their own people, because most of the people actually were against Nazi Germany and sympathized more with the Soviet Union. So they couldn't say, Chamberlain in England and Daladier in Paris could not say to people, look, folks, we're going to encourage Hitler to march against the Soviet Union. You don't mind, do you? They would have minded big time. So they had to pretend they did it all to save peace in the world, right? Yeah. But Hitler obviously knew that and took advantage so much that it became very obvious that actually that their policy was a total failure, right? And then when he attacked Poland, they had no choice but to declare war. What I'm saying here is they had no choice but to declare war. And they declared a phony war, just to basically appease the public. But they sat on their rear end. They did nothing at all. I mean, when Poland was attacked by Nazi Germany in September 1939, and Britain and France declared war, you know, they could easily have moved across the border into Germany because the entire German army was fighting Poland in the east, right? But they didn't, because they wanted Germany basically to overrun Poland, because they didn't care about Poland. They didn't give a damn about Poland, because they realized also that, okay, Hitler's probably right. He needs Poland so he can attack the Soviet Union. And that's what they wanted. But so they declared war basically to save face, but they didn't really want war with Hitler. They were kind of hoping that Hitler would defeat Poland quickly and would then finally do what they had always hoped to do, he would do, namely attack the Soviet Union. And that didn't quite work out the way they had hoped. But that is the reason why they declared phony war and fought basically a phony war.
Okay, but then why after Poland, why didn't Britain and France accept a peace offer that Hitler made? Because I think Hitler made a lot of peace offer to France and Britain in 1939 and 1940.
The peace offers at that stage, Hitler was so discredited in the Western world, in France, by the public, that even the governments were so embarrassed, you know, by what happened. In fact, Chamberlain eventually fell, and Churchill took over. That no peace offer by Hitler could be taken seriously. In fact, you got to keep in mind, guys like Chamberlain would probably have liked to accept the peace offer from Hitler, because the peace offer of Hitler that Hitler came up with after the defeat of Poland was essentially and the idea that he would then finally he was now ready to do what the Western world had expected from him. He attacked the Soviet Union, and he wanted a kind of a peace with them, meaning a guarantee that they would not bother him while he would march east to do a number on the Soviet Union. And actually, that was an offer which many people in Britain kind of liked. In fact, you may or may not know that in the winter of 1939, or maybe it was a little later, at that time then, when Britain and France were officially at war with Germany already, Poland was already finished, right? And now everybody was thinking, the elites were thinking, now Hitler can move against the Soviet Union, right? That's when an American representative, Mr. Mooney, who actually worked for General Motors, who had big business interests in Nazi Germany, he actually represented Roosevelt and traveled to London and Paris to see if maybe perhaps we could make an arrangement, and come to a deal with Hitler so that Hitler can finally do what we want him to do, namely march against the Soviet Union. And in fact, when in that same winter, the Soviet Union fought a war against Finland, which we can talk about also, the British and the French, even though they were at war against Germany, were preparing to send troops to Finland to fight against the Soviet Union, even though they were at war with Nazi Germany. So it's kind of crazy how how the governments wanted one thing, but had to take into account the public opinion.
Okay, because for me, the reason I see that Germany and France declared Britain and France declared war on Germany. For me, the reason is that they all. Am I wrong to say that there was also an imperialist conflict between these countries?
Well, the imperialist conflict was there, but I mean that at that stage, it's obvious that Britain and France were partners, and Germany was confronted them. But while there was an imperialist rivalry, the Second World War also involved a conflict between imperialist powers in general and an anti-imperialist power, which happened to be the Soviet Union. Okay, yeah. So while France and Germany and France, Britain on one side, and Germany had opposing interests and were rivals, and in some cases then real out enemies, the Germans, as well as the French elites and the British elites and the American elites, were anti-imperialists, were against the Soviet Union as well. In fact, one of the ironies of history is that those imperialist powers, Britain and France and the United States, would end up being allies of an anti-imperialist country called the Soviet Union, right? And that was an unnatural alliance, which was doomed to fall apart as soon as the common enemy was eliminated, and that was in 1945, right?
Okay, because I think that by declaring war on Germany in 1939, Britain and France transformed what would have been a regional war between Germany and the Soviet Union, and it's France and Britain who transformed that war into a full world war, which I think they are to blame. I'm not supporting even if I'm against communism. I don't support in any way the idea that Germany would have attacked the Soviet Union. I'm against imperialism. But I think that if the war would have been contained to Hitler and Stalin, Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, it would have been better because it would have killed a lot less people.
So, well, yeah, the idea of appeasement, which is what we call the policy of Britain and France in the late 1930s, policies pursued by Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Britain, and Daladier, the Prime Minister of France. Policy of appeasement then aimed at encouraging Hitler to attack the Soviet Union, and that would have meant no war with Germany in the West. That's why Chamberlain came back and said peace in our time after he had gone to Munich. He already meant peace for us, but war in the East, right? That was the great idea, And so, that is really then what they wanted was what you're now talking about, the possibility of a limited war between Germany and the Soviet Union, right? Okay. Now, first of all, these are two big countries, right? Germany and Soviet Union. To now call a war between those two a limited war is probably wrong, because a big war between two big countries can never be a limited war. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I agree.
It would bigger. But I just want to say one more thing. Yeah, essentially, that war would have ended up with one of the two winning the war, right? Now, obviously, right? Unless it would. Okay, now I just want to follow here. The idea of Chamberlain and Daladier was that Germany would win that war. And they were as confident as Hitler himself that Germany, that the commies in Russia, the Ruskies, had no hope in hell of winning the war against Germany. So essentially, what they were hoping for was a victory of Germany, right? Okay, and this is what some people, were worried about. That's what Churchill was worried about. Churchill said, okay, a war, in a way, we don't like the Nazis, maybe we do, but maybe we don't, and we don't like the commies. Wouldn't that be great if they fight each other? The problem is one of them was going to win, right? And if Nazi Germany wins, Nazi Germany will be #1 in Europe for the rest of the time.
Exactly. Okay.
Exactly. So are you willing to live with that now? Now you said a nice little war between two countries and nobody gets bothered. Oh well, the consequences are going to be dramatic, right? But now, worse than that. Churchill criticized the policy of appeasement because he said, well, first of all, if Germany wins, we're going to have a problem because Germany is going to be a much bigger competitor than they're now already. Germany was already just as powerful, if not more powerful than Britain in 1930s, right? Yeah. Even though they had lost the First World War. If they now defeat the Soviet Union, they're going to be a giant, a colossus. We can never beat them. But what if you're all mistaken? And somehow Nazi Germany does not win, and the Soviets win, then the Red Army will end up in Belgium and then Calais, looking at the English Channel. Are you happy then? So to say that it would have been nice to have just a little war, but just Germany and just Russia, that ignores the very dramatic potential consequences.
Okay, now on that, I agree. I see your point that for the ruling class, let's say I can name them, for British and French imperialism, they had two problems. They had communism and they had German imperialism.
That's right. So essentially, it was a lose-lose situation, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so on that, my position is that on war. I'm always non-intervention. You don't start a war. If your neighbor does, look, you may want to defend yourself, okay, but you don't go in. So for me, France and Britain should not have declared war on Germany, and for me, I think it's an horrible mistake.
But like I say, the problem would have been then that one of the two would have won, and that would have been a problem. Then it would have been a problem. Right?
But now
because it was just for a moment, from the perspective of France, for example, if now France and Britain would have done nothing, and Germany would have taken the war against the Soviet Union and would have defeated the Soviet Union, what would that have meant for France? It would have meant that France would have been next. Hitler would have turned around, and with the might of the Soviet Union, the resources of the Soviet Union, and the victory already. Yeah. I mean, he would have just crushed France like an egg. He would have gone through the French army like a hot knife through butter, right? And Britain would have been next, essentially. So that would not, the prospects would not have been very good.
I'm not saying you're wrong, but I'm not saying it's me. I think that German imperialism had learned like a lesson, that because Hitler blamed the Kaiser for many things. He said that the Kaiser challenged Britain, and Hitler wanted, I think, that he wanted Germany to be allied with Britain, and but he wanted Britain to recognize a place to Germany on the continent. He wanted a German empire, but he tried not to challenge too much British imperialism. But British and French imperialism didn't agree either. So,
well, the first you talk about the Kaiser and Hitler's criticism of the Kaiser. You're talking about the events, the politics, the policies of the German government that led to the First World War, right? And indeed, we can ask ourselves, why did Britain go to war against Germany in 1914? And I deal with that quite in depth in my book. And then once again, I'm demolishing, or so I think, the myth that surrounds these events. We are usually told in our school books that Britain went to war. Britain really didn't have any reason to enter the war in 1914 because it was mostly a conflict between France and Germany and Russia. And Britain could have simply said, sorry, we're not going to fight. But they did it to save little Belgium. You know what I mean? Save little Belgium. Presumed that was but the reality is that the British government in 1914 did not give a fig about little Belgium, you know,
Of course
and
not.
didn't give a damn which country's neutrality was violated by Germany or France or whoever, as Germany did with Belgian neutrality. That gave the British an excuse, a pretext for entering the war.
Exactly.
Britain herself would actually violate the neutrality of quite a few countries in the First World War, including Greece, for example, right?
Yeah. And in fact, they had the biggest empire, so they violated the neutrality of like Africa, India, and yeah.
But what I want to say is this: Britain's major concern before the war was that Germany was becoming too strong a rival in the imperialist rat race industrially, and especially was threatening the most sensitive thing of all for the British, namely the supremacy of the Royal Navy on the high seas, because the Germans were building a huge navy, and like the British, the Germans' navy would need petroleum, you know, to sail around the world, and because coal was no longer the fuel of choice. And like Britain, Germany had no petroleum in its own land, well, a very little bit. So like Britain, Germany had its eyes on the newly discovered oil wells of the Mesopotamia, what is now Iraq, right? And the problem for Germany, for Britain, was that Germany had an alliance with the Ottoman Empire, which controlled Iraq and was working closely together with them and even building a railway that would link Berlin all the way to Baghdad. And to the British, that spelled in the future a control of Germany over the oil wells of Mesopotamia, which we want, okay? And that's why the British made plans for a war against this Turkey to take that land. And that meant war with Germany. And that is when basically Britain wanted war with Germany. And that's why Britain actually warmed up to a former enemy, namely France, and another former enemy, namely Russia, to make a common front, to go to war together against Germany. Because the British felt the French and the Russians can take care of the German enemy in Europe, while we take our army from India to the Mesopotamia and occupy the Middle East, which is exactly what would happen, right?
Yes.
But all that was done in secret. And when the war broke out, the British government could not say, okay, folks in Britain, we're going to go to war because we want the oil wells of Mesopotamia. They couldn't say that. So they were looking for a pretext. And then somebody said, look, the Germans are moving into Belgium. And say, oh, great. You know, that's the excuse we need. And so what I'm saying is that the conflict that the First World War was, as a conflict between Britain and Germany, was not the result of the Kaiser's policies to be criticized or not by Hitler. No, it was Britain wanting that war to prevent.
On that, I agree with you.
Yeah. Okay.
What I say is that Hitler, Hitler was an evil man. Well, I think that most politicians.
You can say that about Winston Churchill too.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
And of course, it's been said a million times about Lenin and Stalin and everybody else. You know, there's very few.
We won't argue on this. So Hitler blamed the Kaiser for having a fleet and for challenging the British Empire, and he said that in order to not have a war with the British Empire, we should not challenge them on the international markets and have an autarkic economy in our empire that we're going to carve out of Eastern Europe, and not having a big fleet to challenge them. I think that it proves a little bit of sincerity that at least German imperialism tried to avoid a clash with British imperialism. I'm not saying that German imperialism was good or moral. I'm saying that British imperialism has a huge responsibility in the Second World War itself. We cannot just blame German imperialism. We also have to blame French imperialism, British imperialism, US imperialism. Does it make sense?
Japanese imperialism.
Oh yeah, sure.
Well, that's the whole thing. The nature of imperialism is basically war. It's all about conquest and control of foreign countries. And the reality is that the inhabitants of foreign countries don't like to be controlled by others, at their own expense, and they will fight back. We see that happening now, for example, in Israel, so that there's a lot of pushback against that. But indeed, imperialism is by its nature aggressive and therefore warlike. No doubt about it. There's no such thing as a peaceful imperialist country.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. There may be nuance. Like me, I said, at least German imperialism for me was at least trying to avoid war with the West. It's what I think. It doesn't make it good.
Well, what you have is that the rivalry among imperialist powers involved identifying enemies, good enemies versus bad enemies, and some enemies were great enemies and some were not so good, but also finding allies, right? For example, Britain until about 1900 was always an enemy of France and Russia, and basically a friend of Germany. In fact, the monarchy in Britain was a German family, right?
Absolutely,
and that changed in the early 1900s because of factors that I alluded to, like the need to have the oil of Mesopotamia, for which you needed the help of France and Russia, and you needed to avoid Germany getting it. So that alliances, finding partners, is part of the game, if you want, or the conflict of imperial rivalry. And that's what happens. Every country is constantly looking for what could be a useful ally or useful enemy. You see the same thing in the United States in recent years. Many enemies of the United States were former allies. Saddam Hussein was a wonderful ally of the United States when they were eyeing Iran, and he was an enemy of Iran. So they supported him, supplied him with poison gas and everything he needed. He was a great buddy of ours. And then suddenly he becomes an enemy, right? You can say the same thing about the rulers of countries like Panama, who were at one point working for the CIA, and later on suddenly are branded to be a new Hitler and therefore become enemies of the United States, right? There's a saying, I don't know who said it somewhere, it's very dangerous to be a friend of the United States because it could be the next enemy.
And there are already some joke about Zelensky in Ukraine that he's a good friend of the United States now. But
watch out, yes, watch out.
Okay, I want to ask two more questions because I'm hearing some clashes of plates. So maybe I think your dinner gonna be ready soon.
Yeah, my wife is making dinner. That's right. Yes.
Okay. Me, and I have been criticized a lot for that. For me, the imperialism and the colonialism of the allies like Britain, France, the US, but also Belgium, Holland, for me, all the evil they have done, the genocide that has been done, I don't think it's very different from what Hitler did. I put them like in the same category. Do you agree?
Well, the same category and in a similar category, I would say.
Similar.
There's a book I would recommend to you. It's called La Férocité Blanche. La Férocité Blanche. And it's written by a French woman of Colombian origin. I read it about 10 years ago. It's La Férocité Blanche. And it talks about how the Western imperialist countries, the colonial powers, ranging from Belgium to Germany to Britain, have massacred millions of people in Africa, Asia, and elsewhere. And basically, nobody ever made a big deal of it.
Continue.
So nobody.
I just want to pick up a book.
Yeah. And she argues that it is a bit hypocritical for the West to now make a big deal that Hitler basically exterminated the Jews, which is, of course, a big deal. But what she is saying is not that they should not criticize Hitler. What she is saying is that they should look at their own record and realize that the Western world has committed massacres and genocides, even every bit as big as the one that Hitler committed at the expense of Jews, the Judeocide, as it's called. And the basic example that she comes up with, one of them, it was well known, is what happened, what the German colonial power did when they were the masters of what is now Namibia, which was called Southwest Africa. when they basically exterminated the Herero tribe or people, and also what some of the British did to the Irish already, and later on to the Indians, and the Belgians in the Congo, it's huge massacres. And of course, the question is, when does a massacre become a genocide? Now, we use the word genocide a bit too quickly, I believe myself. But I mean, it's true that there's been huge massacres that were certainly very similar to genocides. And there have been genocides that were really more like major massacres. But again, we can argue about those things. But so the book is called La Férocité Blanche.
Okay, I noted it. Jacques, do you know how, because right now, I think that my screen is a tiny windows in the corner. Do you know how we can put our two screens side by side? Because I think the book I'm showing, that people cannot see them.
I don't know how to do this. No, I don't. I'm not very good at this. Or share screen? No. But hold on for a second. I want to show you something. I think I have it here.
I have it. I got it. Thank you. Yes.
So it's a very good book.
Midi. Yeah. Here, I have this book that I think that the Black Book from Colonialism by Marc Ferro. I think that they bring good stuff.
Yes,
of course, many years ago, you recommended to me the book Human Smoke by Nicole Baker, in which he shows the terrible things that the British Empire did in their colony, but it's really on the surface. Recently, I bought this book. I don't know if you heard about it, Legacy of Violence, a history of the British Empire. So I think I gotta learn stuff in that. So that was my last question. Now I just want to show again the book that you wrote, because now it's gonna be easier for the people to see them.
Right.
The Myth of the Good War, the United States and the Second World War. We have Big Business with Hitler.
Right.
We have the
Great Class War. The Great Class War.
1914, 1918, and the myths of modern history.
Correct. Yeah.
I was afraid when I switched the windows that it would close everything. I really got bad lucks recently.
Yes.
So maybe one last question before we end. I know that our difference is on the issue of capitalism, but for you, what meant the Soviet Union? How do you see the Soviet Union? And maybe tell us, why do you think the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991? Because I want to be fair. I'm a libertarian. I believe in free market. I don't like communism, but I want people to hear, because you defend it very well.
Okay, I'll tell you two things. You asked me two questions. One is what I think about the Soviet Union, and secondly, why did it collapse? Okay, well, first of all, the two questions basically are related.
Yes.
Because the question is presumably, or the main reason given for the collapse of the Soviet Union is that socialism, communism doesn't work. Well, it's actually the record shows the total opposite. And let me just tell you what the record shows. When communism was established in Russia in 1917 with the Russian Revolution, which then it was Revolutionary Russia was the name we called it, and in 1922 I think it became the Soviet Union. Yeah. At that stage, by the time basically the revolutionaries got going, when the Civil War ended, so it's now 1920 already. It was a few years. Russia had been at war for something like 6-7 years, had suffered millions of people killed, and huge destruction throughout the land, okay? And Russia, by the way, even in 1914, before this terrible war started, these terrible wars, plural, started, had been one of the most backward, poorest countries in Europe, with the most exploited and backward and illiterate population anywhere in Europe, okay? So that is where we were when the communism got established, all right? Now, when communism ended, Russia was #2 power in the world. Okay, much more powerful, than Britain or France. Only the United States was stronger, right? And the standard of living of most people in Russia was a million times better than it had been in 1914 or 1920. With
On that, I'm sure that
with
it's,
no
yeah.
luxury, no people having two-car garage and driving Mercedes, but we should compare with other countries that were in the same boat in 1920, or we should not compare with the rich parts of the capitalist world. We should compare maybe with the poor parts of the capitalist world, which includes the colonies, by the way. So if I compare, for example, India in 1914 and Russia in 1914, India today still has a huge number of poor people, very, very poor. And in Russia today is a sophisticated country. Russia essentially became one of the greatest industrial powers in the world, all thanks to the efforts of basically a government and the people that were basically led by a government that was communist. So in a way, and not only that, that country actually, in the meantime, in that's 40, well, 1920 to 1990, so we 70 years. In those 70 years, that country had been attacked by the world's biggest military power, Nazi Germany, and had suffered 30 million people killed and the destruction of most of the country, for which it was never compensated because the Americans blocked any reparation payments, right? And they had defeated that monstrous country, the Third Reich. I would say that's an achievement that is absolutely incredible. It's an enormous achievement. Other countries were not attacked by the same way, did not suffer that, and still weren't ahead. The Soviet Union, in spite of all that, overtook major powers like Britain and France and left them basically eating dust. And if you consider where countries like Africa, which are also part of the capitalist world, are they? And Latin America, and many parts of the Middle East have gone nowhere since that time. So I would say that the record of the Soviet Union is fabulous. It's an amazing achievement. And then you think about the technological achievements. They were the first ones to actually explore outer space. They weren't the first on the moon. Well, that didn't do anything for the Americans anyways. I'm just saying, and the Russians had leading the world in many ways, scientifically, universities and all that. And formerly poor people were now engineers, and women were engineers and doctors. So you could say that the achievement of the Soviet Union, whether you like it or not, is actually admirable. It's fantastic. It's amazing. And you can say the same thing for China, because when China in 1949 became established as a communist country, it was one of the poorest countries in the world. And today, they're basically causing us to eat dust. If I look at what China is today, where we are today, where their trains zipping around all over the country, and we have old via rail clunkers, we have a railway that's in the 19th century still, right? If you think about it, right? So, I mean, we're falling behind so fast. So the two countries that have demonstrated the most spectacular advance in human terms in the 20th and 21st century are the Soviet Union and China, and they're both communist countries. Okay. And the reason why the Soviet Union collapsed has a lot to do with two reasons, essentially, two major reasons. First of all, the Soviet Union, ever since it was set up, never had a moment of peace. They were always beleaguered, attacked, subject to destabilization, as the Americans called it, to all kinds of pressures from outside. It was what Michael Parenti, a great author, called it was a beleaguered kind of fortress of socialism. It was never allowed to work in peace. I mean, it was like an experiment that was totally disturbed all the damn time, right? So it could use that as an excuse. So that was one reason why the country didn't do so well, didn't do as well as it could have done, and also because the arms race, the threat of the Cold War, forced the Soviet Union to invest a lot of its capital, of its resources, in defense, in warfare, which of course is useless for ordinary people. In fact, it's an albatross around your neck. It's costly, right? And the Soviet Union would much have preferred not to have done this. They could have invested more money in positive achievements, but they couldn't. And the second reason is that in the Soviet Union, contrary to popular belief that communist systems are monolithic and everybody thinks exactly the same way, it's not true. I mean, there's different opinions in many ways. From the beginning, there were differences of opinion. For example, between I'll just say something, Stalin and Trotsky. Stalin believed that you could build up socialism in one country. Trotsky said no, it must have world revolution. They didn't like each other. They fought. Later on, Trotsky supported an opposition in the Soviet Union. There was major problems like that as well, and that continued. Basically, especially broke out in the open after Stalin's death. And then you had people like Gorbachev, who was supposedly a reformer, but we now know he basically hated communism. He was a social democrat, and he basically dismantled the Soviet Union. Most people did not want to dismantle the Soviet Union. There was actually a poll of the people in the Soviet Union still before it was dissolved by a criminal called Yeltsin, who was a criminal, drunk, and a swine. And that poll, more than half of the people wanted to keep the Soviet Union. They were quite happy in the Soviet Union. I'm not saying they were ecstatic. I'm not saying there was no criticism, but you're going to say the same thing about the United States and Canada. No, there's a lot of people who are unhappy about the way things are. So that's my argument. I don't come from a communist family or background, not even socialist. I come from a very conservative, clerical background where we were told when I grew up that the communists were monsters. Soviet Union was like a hellhole, all bad things. It's through my study of history that I've learned differently. It's through my study of history that I've come to see things that we can argue about it. That the lives of people in Russia improved enormously in the 70 years or 60, 70 years of the existence of the Soviet Union. And you also know that the proof is in the pudding again when in 1990, Yeltsin, that monster, basically buried the Soviet Union. That was the worst decade in the history of Russian history. People were the poverty, the misery was huge, never seen before. So most people were very, very unhappy. And even today, many people felt they were much better off in the time of the Soviet Union than they are now under Putin's Russia.
Okay. What do you answer to people who claim that the Soviet Union and communist China committed the worst genocide against their own population, with tens of millions of people dying from starvation and repression?
That's simply not true. That's simply not true. No,
you disagree with that?
Yeah, I disagree with a couple of things. I agree that people say that, but I mean that's pure propaganda. A lot of these books that are if I would want to make money now, for example, as an historian, right? I would write a book about Russia and say how what a monster Stalin was, and I would invent lots of things, how he liked to torture his parrot, for example, and things like that, and immediately would believe that. Immediately people would believe that, because the more you say, the more the monstrous activities you ascribe to them, the more success you'll have. And so that is simply not true. There's serious studies done about the number of victims. For example, there was never the percentage of people in prisons, in the Soviet Union was never as high as the percentage of people in prisons in the United States today. Okay, and that's the famous Gulag. Now, were there people in prisons? Of course there were, because there was a lot of opposition. There was a lot of enemies. In fact, during the war and after the war, a lot of prisoners were Nazis, German prisoners, and Nazis and collaborators, because there were lots of collaborators. I mean, from the beginning in the Soviet Union, there was an opposition. And it was a violent opposition that used murder and sabotage, to further their aims. We know that too. So people were, and I'm sure some innocent people were killed as well. There's no doubt about it. But the millions. Let me just say one thing here now. For example, Manuel, I just came back from Spain. Okay, and in Spain, they have uncovered in recent years mass graves where they found the bodies of the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people that were shot by the Franco forces at the end of the Civil War, okay? Because they killed lots and lots of people. And they buried them in mass graves, okay? And these mass graves now, they identify the people, and they're all over Spain. Now, do you remember seeing on CNN, mass graves being opened in Russia where these millions of people were supposedly buried? Because we know one thing, that the camps, the Gulag, were not concentration camps, were not extermination camps like the ones in Germany. They were work camps, where basically people were put to work. And actually people were even paid a wage for it, okay? And if they, so it was not like what people imagine. But what I'm just saying is that there was never ever any gas chambers, any ovens where they cremated people. So if they killed millions of people, where are all these bodies? I mean, it's very difficult to dispose of bodies, you know. And if indeed millions were killed, and with an anti-communist government in power under Yeltsin, for example, wouldn't you think that they would have invited the movie crew, the film crews of CNN to film these mass graves and show all these thousands of bodies? Not one, zero. And it didn't happen. And the proof is also in the demographic evolution. If you look at the demographic evolution of the Soviet Union, you know, and taking into account the losses of the war, 30 million people being killed, you know, then actually there's no way that this reflects the kinds of supposedly millions of people killed. That is simply a figure grabbed out of thin air by writers like Robert Conquest, for example, who was actually worked for the British Secret Service, and who is known to have not used a single primary source for his work. He simply copied, or whatever somebody told him, the more awful it was about Stalin or whatever, the better. He wrote it all down, and that then was applauded as a wonderful book in the West. Today, serious historians dismiss Conquest as a zero, no value whatsoever. Solzhenitsyn was similarly, he was not an historian. He wrote fiction, but he's supposedly the big authority on the Gulag. I mean, it's mind-blowing how misrepresented all this is. So that's my opinion on it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I try to be open-minded. I agree that anti-communist people will be maybe biased to believe things. I think that they are under a communist system. There are things that I don't like and disagree and think I'm wrong. I understand why people make communist revolution, like the Russian Revolution. I understand why people made it. There was a lot of legitimacy into it. And today, if you ask me, the way the so-called capitalist system works, I totally hate it. It's a horrible nightmare where a tiny fraction of the population gather all the wealth and start war. And I want to put an end to it. I have no problem to expropriate the wealth of most billionaires, because I don't think they acquired it morally. They acquired it through the state. It's just the idea of a monopoly that abolish private property. For me, I don't want to live under that, and I disagree with that. Yeah. But look, Jacques, I know that you recommend the book on Stalin.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, a great book. I read that. I know it.
Okay. A few years ago, I offered you a book, and you were kind enough to read it. It's a book from a libertarian historian, yes, Ralph Raico. I know you disagreed with some stuff in it, and it's okay. But I admire your open-mindedness, and I have to reciprocate. And myself, I promise you that I will read this book on Stalin. And if there are people who are curious to hear another view of Stalin, I mean, I talk with people that think Hitler was a good guy, and that the Holocaust was not what we are told it is. I think those people have the right of free speech, and that I want to consider what they have to say. I think that what we call the non-aggression principle, that is the core of the libertarian philosophy, I think it's right and accurate. But if 95% of mankind want a form of socialism, I think there's a way they could have it, and I will not oppose to it. So, I want to thank you very much for that. I think it was a great talk, and that you brought a lot of knowledge, of fact that people can learn from in order to oppose war and to stop believing the myth that Hollywood and the government
and the media
are spreading, and that it continues today in order to sell a war that could come with China and Russia, which would be a real catastrophe. Because right now, you and me, we can disagree on whether private property of a factory is a good thing. We can disagree on that. But if we have a nuclear war and that we die from it, it's over. We can no longer talk about it.
We're all finished. Yes, that's true. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's true.
So I have great respect and great admiration for your work, and I was happy. I think I shared your book. So if people wants to read them, I encourage them. So Jacques, is there? Do you have a final thought you want to say?
No, thank you. I just want to thank you for inviting me, Manuel. It was kind of a fun, always like a good discussion, you know. And it's interesting to talk about it. It's a great topic. It's an important topic. It's a very, very, very important even today to understand what these wars are all about. And indeed, as you mentioned, the risk now of a major war involving Russia and China, that is an awful thought, because that would be basically the end of all of us, you know, because
it's a war that includes nuclear weapons. Yes. I mean, in the Second World War, you know, there were aircraft carrier, there were a heavy bomber, but until Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there were no nuclear bomb. And the nuclear weapon we have today are sometimes hundreds times more stronger than what they used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the danger, I think you know what is a nuclear winter, like it's the winter on most of the planet for 10 or 15 years because of if there are too much nuclear detonation, the sun cannot, it will kill like 99% of mankind. So, and I see people that they want to appear good, and philosophy is not about appearing, being popular. Philosophy is about being right and being morally good. But you know, people want to appear good by saying that Putin is the devil and that it's like Hitler, and by supporting that, by saying that they support their own governments that provoke even more Putin, which could lead to a nuclear. And I tell them, hey, I understand you want to look good by supporting Ukrainian people. And yes, the Ukrainian people are suffering a lot. That's sad. But think that provoking Russia into a war with nuclear weapon what could happen? We are all dead. Oh God, it's more important than just virtue signaling.
Right. Yeah, that's right. Okay.
Jacques, I wish you a good evening. Thank you very much again.
Thank you much. Gotta go for dinner now.
Yeah, arrête.